The flames that would change everything began with a single spark on a widow's windowsill. But the fire that truly mattered had been smoldering in Nathaniel Cordova's chest for 3 long months. You can almost taste the acrid smoke that billowed across the valley that October evening, thick as molasses and twice as bitter. The wind carried it straight to where Nathaniel sat astride his black stallion, surveying the land his railroad money had bought him. 10,000 acres of prime grazing country stretching from the mesa to the creek. But all that wealth meant nothing when he saw the orange glow dancing against the twilight sky. Rosalind Thorne's cabin was burning. He'd been watching her from afar since the day she'd buried her husband. Not in any unseemly way. Nathaniel Cordova was a gentleman, raised proper by his Spanish grandmother despite the rough country that had hardened him. But a man couldn't help but notice a woman like Rosalind, even in her mourning black. Especially in her mourning black, she'd come to Esperanza Creek 2 years prior with her husband James, a quiet man who'd tried to work a claim that had already broken 3 other families. The land was cursed, the townsfolk whispered. Nothing good ever came from that stretch of rocky ground where the creek bent sharp toward the mountains. The whispers proved prophetic. James Thorne died of fever that first winter, leaving behind a 26-year-old widow and a cabin that barely kept the wind out. Most women would have packed up and headed back east. Rosalind had rolled up her sleeves and learned to split wood, now spurring his horse toward the flames. Nathaniel wondered if the curse had finally claimed her too. The stallion's hooves drummed against the hard-packed earth as they crested the hill. Below, the cabin blazed like a funeral pyre, its pine logs crackling and spitting sparks into the darkening sky. The vegetable garden Rosalind had coaxed from the stubborn soil lay trampled, her precious tomato plants crushed under boot prints. This was no accident. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The Brennan brothers had been making noise about wanting that land, claiming James Thorne's widow had no business trying to prove up the claim on her own. They'd made their intentions clear enough at the general store, loud enough for half the town to hear. A woman's got no place out there alone, the eldest brother had declared, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from being born to money and meanness. It ain't natural. But where was Rosalind? Nathaniel swung down from his horse, his boots hitting the ground running. The heat hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. Smoke stung his eyes, turning the world into a hazy nightmare of orange and black. Rosalind. His voice cracked like a whip across the roar of flames. Rosa. No answered. He circled the cabin, looking for any sign of her. The henhouse stood empty, its door hanging open. The milk cow was gone from her pen. Smart woman. She'd gotten the animals out first. But that didn't mean she'd gotten herself out. Through the smoke, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. A piece of pale blue fabric caught on a splintered board near the cabin's back door. The same cornflower blue of the dress she'd worn to Sunday service last week. The one that had made him forget his own name when she'd smiled at him across the churchyard. The back door hung off its hinges, black smoke pouring from the gap like water from a broken dam. Inside, he could see the red heart of the fire consuming everything she'd built since James died. The quilts she'd sewn by lamplight. The books she'd read aloud to herself on quiet evenings. The chair where she'd sat to mend her stockings, humming melodies that drifted across the valley like prayers, all of it feeding the flames. Nathaniel pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, but it did little good. The smoke was everywhere now, thick as soup and twice as poisonous. His eyes streamed tears that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the hellish heat. He should turn back, should ride to town and fetch help. Any sensible man would have done just that. But Nathaniel Cordova had not become the richest man in 3 counties by being sensible. He'd done it by taking calculated risks, by seeing opportunities where other men saw only obstacles. And right now, the only calculation that mattered was simple. Rosalind Thorne might be dying in that cabin, and he'd be damned if he let that happen. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he pushed through the doorway. The heat was unbearable, pressing against him like a living thing. Flames licked at the walls, consuming years of careful homemaking in minutes. "Rosa," he called again, his voice hoarse. "Where are you?" Then he heard it, a sound so faint it might have been the wind through the eaves. But Nathaniel knew better. He'd heard that sound before, in his dreams, and in the quiet moments when he let himself imagine what it might be like to hold her. Rosalind Thorne was crying. The sound came from the back room, where a burning beam had fallen across the doorway. Beyond it, he could see her, curled on the floor beside her bed, a trunk clutched to her chest. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, spilling across her shoulders like spilled ink. She wasn't unconscious. She was trapped. The beam was massive, easily 2 feet thick and burning on both ends. It would take 3 men to move it under the best conditions. These were not the best conditions. Nathaniel studied the situation with the same cold calculation he'd used to outwit railroad barons and cattle kings. The ceiling was starting to sag. The walls were compromised. He had maybe 2 minutes before. The whole structure came down. But sometimes 2 minutes was all the time a man needed to change his life forever. He wrapped his hands around the burning beam, feeling the heat sear through his leather gloves, and began to pull. But as his muscles strained against the weight, a new sound reached his ears, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats and the rough laughter of men who'd come to watch their handiwork burn. The beam shifted an inch. Then two, splinters of burning would raining down like hellish snow. Nathaniel's muscles screamed in protest, but he could see Rosalind's face now, pale as moonlight, streaked with soot and tears, her green eyes wide with something between hope and disbelief. Nathaniel. Her voice was barely a whisper, lost in the roar of flames. "What are you? Hush now," he grunted, putting every ounce of strength into lifting the massive timber. "Save your breath for running." The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the coarse laughter of men who'd come to admire their destruction. Through the smoke-hazed window, Nathaniel caught glimpses of torch flames dancing in the darkness. 3 riders, maybe 4, circling the cabin like vultures around carrion. "Well, would you look at that?" came a voice from outside, rough as sandpaper and twice as grating. "Seems like the high and mighty Cordova's playing hero tonight." Bo Brennan, the eldest of the 3 brothers, and the meanest. The kind of man who'd kick a dog just to hear it yelp. "Mighty dangerous in there, don't you think?" called another voice. Jeb, the middle brother. "Man could get himself killed, interfering where he don't belong." The beam gave way suddenly, crashing to the floor in a shower of sparks. Nathaniel lunged forward, catching Rosalind around the waist as she struggled to her feet. The trunk she'd been protecting fell open, spilling its contents across the burning floor. Letters tied with ribbon, a daguerreotype of her and James on their wedding day, a small wooden cross. "My husband's letters," she gasped, reaching for them. "Leave them." Nathaniel's voice was iron. "They're just paper. They're all I have left of him." The ceiling groaned overhead, a sound like the devil's own laughter. Nathaniel didn't waste time arguing. He scooped up what letters he could with one hand, swept Rosalind against his chest with the other, and carried her toward the back door just as the roof began to collapse. They stumbled into the night air, gasping and coughing. The cool October wind felt like a blessing against their smoke-burned lungs. Nathaniel set Rosalind on her feet but kept his arm around her waist, supporting her weight as she swayed. "Well, ain't this touching?" Bo Brennan's voice cut through the night like a rusty blade. "The railroad king and the grieving widow. Makes a man wonder what kind of comfort you've been providing, Cordova." 3 riders sat their horses in a loose semicircle, their faces lit by the flames consuming what had been Rosalind's home. The Brennan brothers, Bo, Jeb, and the youngest, Caleb, who couldn't be more than 19 but already had the dead eyes of a killer. "You boys are out mighty late," Nathaniel said, his voice deceptively calm. His hand moved slowly toward the Colt .45 holstered at his hip. "Dangerous country after dark." "We heard there was a fire," Jeb said, his grin showing teeth yellow as Old Ivory came to help. "Mighty kind of you." Nathaniel's fingers found the grip of his gun. "Though it seems like you're a bit late for firefighting." Behind them, the cabin collapsed in on itself with a roar that shook the ground. Sparks flew like angry stars, and the heat wave nearly knocked them both to their knees. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but a pile of burning timber and ash. Rosalind made a sound like a wounded animal, and Nathaniel felt her knees buckle. He caught her, holding her close as she stared at the destruction of everything she'd built. "Such a shame," Bo said, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. "Widow woman, trying to work a claim all by herself. Bound to end in tragedy. How do you figure that? Nathaniel asked. Why? Accidents happen all the time out here. Lanterns tip over. Sparks from the chimney catch the wrong piece of wood. Of course, a smart woman would have sold out months ago when she had the chance. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Nathaniel had heard the rumors. The Brennan brothers had been pressuring homesteaders to sell their claims for pennies on the dollar. Those who refused found their wells mysteriously poisoned, their fences cut, their livestock run off in the night. I never got an offer, Rosalind said, her voice stronger now, though she still leaned against Nathaniel's chest. Not a legitimate one. Oh, but you did, Caleb spoke up, his boyish face twisted with something ugly. Remember? 2 weeks ago, outside Henderson's store, I made you a real generous offer. The memory hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. He'd been in town that day, had seen Caleb Brennan cornering Rosalind near the hitching post. The young man had been standing too close, his hand on her arm, his voice low and threatening. Nathaniel had started toward them, but Rosalind had pulled away and hurried inside the store before he could reach her. That wasn't a business proposition, Rosalind said, her voice shaking with more than just smoke inhalation. That was what? Caleb's voice turned dangerous. A proposal? Hell, I was being generous. Pretty widow woman like you ought to be grateful for any man's attention. Nathaniel's gun was in his hand before he'd consciously decided to draw it. The movement was fluid, practiced, the result of years spent in rough country where being fast on the draw meant staying alive. That's enough, he said quietly. The brothers tensed, their hands moving toward their own weapons. But Nathaniel had the advantage of being on foot, already aimed, while they were still mounted. Now, don't go doing anything foolish, Bo said, though his voice had lost some of its bluster. We're all neighbors here. Neighbors don't burn down neighbors' homes, Nathaniel replied. Neighbors don't threaten widows in broad daylight. You got proof we did anything but come help fight a fire? Jeb asked, but his eyes were nervous now. Darting between Nathaniel's gun and the burning ruins, Nathaniel studied the three men, calculating odds and angles. He was outnumbered, but he had better position and faster reflexes. More importantly, he had something they didn't, a reason to fight that went deeper than greed or meanness. Rosa, he said without taking his eyes off the brothers. Can you make it to my horse? She nodded, though he could feel her trembling against him. I think so. When I say run, you head for the trees. Don't stop until you reach town. What about you? I'll be along directly. But even as he said it, Nathaniel knew the mathematics of the situation. 3 against 1, in the dark, with Rosalind's safety to consider. Even if he was the best shot in the territory, and he was, the odds weren't in his favor. You know what I think, Bo said, his confidence returning as he realized the same thing. I think you've been sniffing around where you don't belong, Cordova. Widow Thorne here needs a man who understands the realities of frontier life. And you think that's one of you. I think a woman alone is vulnerable to all sorts of accidents. Bo's voice was silk wrapped around steel. Fire's just the beginning. Could be wolves next. Or claim jumpers. Or worse. The threat was clear enough. Sell out or suffer the consequences. It was an old story in this part of the country, where the strong preyed on the weak and the law was whatever you could enforce with a gun. But Nathaniel Cordova hadn't clawed his way from poverty to wealth by backing down from bullies. And he sure as hell wasn't going to start now, not with Rosalind's life hanging in the balance. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded railroad crews and cattle drives. You boys are going to turn around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. And you're going to stay away from Mrs. Thorne. Or what? Caleb asked, his young face flushed with excitement. You'll shoot us all. In cold blood. Won't be cold blood, Nathaniel said. You burned down an innocent woman's home. You threatened her. You're sitting there armed and ready to do worse. Any jury in the territory would call it self-defense. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. You could smell the tension in the air, sharp as gunpowder and twice as dangerous. The horses shifted restlessly, sensing their riders' nerves. Then, from the darkness beyond the circle of firelight, came the sound that changed everything. The distinct metallic click of a rifle being cocked. Well now, said a voice from the shadows. Looks like we got ourselves a regular standoff. Sheriff Tom Hartwell stepped into the light, his Winchester trained on the Brennan brothers. Behind him came two more men, his deputies, both armed and ready. "Sheriff," Bo said, his voice carefully neutral. "Mighty convenient timing." "Not convenient at all," Hartwell replied. "Mrs. Henderson saw the glow from town, sent word there. Was a fire. Came as fast as we could." His eyes swept the scene. The burning ruins, the armed men. Rosalind clutched against Nathaniel's chest. "Appears we might have arrived just in time." The brothers exchanged glances. 3 against 1 had been manageable odds. 3 against 4, with the sheriff and his deputies, was suicide. "Just trying to help with the fire," Jeb said lamely. "I can see that," Hartwell said drily. "Though it's curious how you boys managed to get here so fast, living 15 miles away and all." The world exploded into chaos. Sheriff Hartwell's deputies dove for cover behind a fallen log, their weapons drawn but useless. They couldn't see the shooter in the darkness beyond the firelight. The Brennan brothers' horses reared and wheeled, their riders fighting to control the panicked animals while reaching for their guns. But Nathaniel's attention was fixed on something else entirely, the look of genuine shock on Bo Brennan's face. "What the hell?" Bo's voice cracked with confusion, his earlier swagger replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "That wasn't supposed to." A second shot rang out, this one kicking up dirt inches from Caleb's horse. The youngest, Brennan brother, yelped and nearly fell from his saddle, his face white as bleached bone in the firelight. "Someone's shooting at us," Jeb shouted, wheeling his horse toward the trees. "We need to get out of here." But Nathaniel was already moving, pulling Rosalind behind the overturned water trough that had somehow survived the fire. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. The Brennan brothers weren't acting like men who'd arranged for backup. They were acting like men who'd been caught as off guard as everyone else. "Stay down," he whispered to Rosalind, then called out to the fallen sheriff. "Tom, how bad is it?" Hartwell's voice came back weak but steady. "Shoulder. I'll live." He'd managed to crawl behind a pile of chopped wood, his rifle still in his hands. "But someone's got us pinned down good." Another shot cracked through the night, this one aimed at the deputies. One of them cursed as splinters from the log showered his face. "Can anyone see the shooter?" Nathaniel called. "North Ridge," one of the deputies answered. "Maybe 200 yards out." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. He knew that ridge. It overlooked the entire valley, provided perfect cover for a marksman. More importantly, it was nowhere near the Brennan brothers' usual haunts. "This don't make sense." Bo Brennan's voice carried clearly across the firelit clearing. "Why would someone be shooting at us?" It was a good question, and the answer, when it came, hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. "Because," said a familiar voice from the darkness, "you 3 fools were never supposed to be here tonight." A figure emerged from the shadows beyond the burning cabin, tall, well-dressed, with silver hair gleaming in the firelight. Judge Cornelius Ashford, the most respected man in 3 counties, stepped into the circle of light with a smoking rifle in his hands. "Judge," Sheriff Hartwell's voice was thick with confusion and pain. "What are you doing here?" "Cleaning up a mess," Ashford replied, his cultured voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "Though it seems the mess has gotten considerably more complicated." The pieces clicked into place in Nathaniel's mind with sickening clarity. The judge had been pushing for railroad expansion through the valley. He'd been the one suggesting that small homesteaders should sell their claims to more capable hands. And he'd been the one who'd quietly purchased half a dozen failed claims over the past year, always through intermediaries, always for far less than they were worth. "You're behind this," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "The fires, the threats, the harassment. It's all you." Ashford's smile was cold as winter steel. "Such a quick mind, Mr. Cordova. Though I suppose that's how you made your fortune, seeing patterns where others see only chaos. But why shoot at us?" Bo Brennan demanded, his voice high with outrage. "We was doing what you paid us to do. Were you?" Ashford's tone turned glacial. "Because from where I stood, it looked like you were about to get yourselves arrested. Do you have any idea how that would have complicated things?" The judge's plan was becoming clearer by the moment. Use the Brennan brothers to drive out the small homesteaders, then eliminate the brothers themselves before they could implicate him. Clean, efficient, and completely ruthless. "You were going to kill us," Jeb Brennan said, his voice stunned. After everything we done for you. You were useful, Ashford replied. Past tense. Though I admit, having Mr. Cordova here does present certain opportunities. Nathaniel felt Rosalind's hand clutch at his arm. She'd been following the conversation, putting together the same terrible picture he was seeing. What opportunities? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why? The tragic death of the territory's most prominent citizen, of course. Ashford's rifle swung toward them. Nathaniel Cordova, killed while bravely attempting to rescue a widow from a house fire. The same fire that claimed her life, sadly, and the lives of a corrupt sheriff and his deputies, who'd been taking bribes from the notorious Brennan gang. The audacity of it was breathtaking. With one night's work, Ashford would eliminate everyone who could threaten his land grab and emerge as the territory's grieving but determined leader, ready to bring law and order to a dangerous frontier. You're insane, one of the deputies called out. I'm practical, Ashford corrected. This territory needs strong leadership, not the chaos of small farmers and independent ranchers. Progress requires sacrifice. Progress. Rosalind's voice cut through the night like a blade. You call murder progress? I call it necessity, my dear. The judge's voice held a note of genuine regret. You could have made this so much easier by simply accepting one of the offers for your land. Your husband was a good man, but he had no vision for what this valley could become. He had a vision, Rosalind said, rising from behind the trough despite Nathaniel's attempt to hold her down. He saw a place where families could build something lasting, where children could grow up safe and free. Sentimental nonsense, Ashford dismissed. This land is meant for cattle and railroads, not kitchen gardens and schoolhouses. But as he spoke, Nathaniel noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The judge's attention was fixed on Rosalind, his rifle trained on her slight figure. Behind him, moving through the shadows with the silent grace of a hunter, Sheriff Hartwell was working his way closer. The lawman was wounded, bleeding, but he was still moving, still fighting. You know what I think? Nathaniel said, raising his voice to cover any sound Hartwell might make. I think you're afraid. Afraid? Ashford's laugh was genuinely amused. Of what, pray tell? Of what she represents. Nathaniel gestured toward Rosalind. A woman who won't be bought or intimidated. Who'd rather die than give up what her husband died trying to build. How poetic, the judge said dryly. Though death does seem to be the inevitable outcome. Maybe, Nathaniel conceded. But you'll never own this land. Not really. Because every time you ride through this valley, you'll remember that you had to murder innocent people to get it. I'll learn to live with the burden, Ashford replied. Though, I won't have to live with it for very long. I'm 68 years old, Mr. Cordova. I have perhaps 10 good years left. But in those 10 years, I intend to see this territory become something magnificent. Built on bones, Rosalind said quietly. Built on vision, Ashford corrected. Your bones, they're bones, my bones. In the end, we all fertilize the same soil. The rifle began to swing toward her, and Nathaniel knew they were out of time. He tensed, ready to throw himself between the gun and the woman he'd come to love. Knowing he wouldn't be fast enough, but unable to do anything else, that's when Sheriff Hartwell struck. The wounded lawman launched himself from the shadows, tackling the judge around the waist. Both men went down hard, the rifle flying from Ashford's hands to clatter against the stone foundation of the burned cabin. Now, Hartwell shouted as he grappled with the older man. Take him. Nathaniel vaulted over the water trough, his Colt in his hand. But before he could reach the struggling men, the night exploded with gunfire as the Brennan brothers opened up on everything that moved. The deputies returned fire, their rifles booming in the darkness. Horses screamed and reared. Men shouted and cursed. And through it all, the ruins of Rosalind's cabin continued to burn, casting dancing shadows that turned the whole scene into something from a fever dream. When the smoke cleared, Judge Ashford lay motionless beside the stone foundation, Sheriff Hartwell's bullet in his chest. The Brennan brothers were gone, vanished into the night like the cowards they'd always been. But the real surprise was yet to come. Nathaniel, Rosalind said, her voice strange and distant. Look, she was kneeling beside the scattered contents of her trunk, the letters and photographs that had spilled across the ground during their escape. But she wasn't looking at her dead husband's correspondence. She was looking at a leather-bound journal, its pages singed but still readable. A journal that had been hidden in a secret compartment of the trunk, concealed so well that even she hadn't known it existed. James Thorne's journal. And from the look on Rosalind's face, it contained secrets that would change everything. The journal's pages rustled like autumn leaves in Rosalind's trembling hands. By the dying light of her burned home, she read words that made her blood run cold as mountain snow. March 15th, 1882, she read aloud, her voice carrying across the smoky clearing. Met with Surveyor Thompson today. He confirmed what I suspected. There's a silver vein running directly under the creek bed, rich enough to make a man wealthy beyond imagining. But someone already knows. Someone's been buying up claims through false names, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sheriff Hartwell, still bleeding from his shoulder wound, struggled to his feet. Keep reading. March 22nd. Ashford came by today, made another offer for the land. Said it was his final one. When I refused, he smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. Accidents happen to stubborn men, he said, especially men who stick their noses where they don't belong. Nathaniel felt his jaw clench. He threatened James directly. There's more, Rosalind continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. April 3rd, found boot prints around the cabin this morning. Someone's been watching us. Rosa doesn't know. I haven't told her about any of this. How can I? She's already scared enough about making it through the winter. The wind picked up, sending sparks from the ruined cabin dancing across the pages like fireflies. In the distance, thunder rumbled. A storm was coming, and with it, the kind of darkness that would make escape impossible. April 10th, Rosalind read on. Fever's getting worse. Rosa thinks it's just the lung sickness that's been going around, but I know better. The water's been tasting strange for weeks now. Bitter, like it's been poisoned. If something happens to me, I pray she'll be smart enough to leave this place. The silver's cursed. It'll bring nothing but death to whoever tries to claim it. Poisoned, one of the deputies breathed. He poisoned the well. Son of a bitch, Hartwell muttered, pressing his good hand against his wounded shoulder. James Thorne didn't die of natural causes. He was murdered. The implications hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. Rosalind had been living on poison land. For months, drinking from a contaminated well, slowly being killed by the same man who'd now tried to burn her alive. Rosa, he said urgently, catching her arm. How long have you been feeling sick? Headaches, nausea, weakness? Her face went pale. I thought it was just grief. The sleepless nights, the poor appetite. It's the water, Nathaniel said grimly. Ashford's been poisoning you too, just slower this time. Waiting for you to either die or give up and leave. But before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the night. Not the wild galloping of fleeing men, but the steady, purposeful advance of riders who knew exactly where they were going. That's not the Brennan brothers, Hartwell said, squinting into the darkness. They'd be halfway to Mexico by now. The riders emerged from the gloom. 6 men, all armed, all wearing the kind of clothes that spoke of money and authority. At their head rode a figure Nathaniel recognized with a sinking heart. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, Judge Ashford's business partner and the territory's most powerful railroad investor. Good evening, Whitfield called out, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Party's over, Colonel, Hartwell replied, his rifle trained on the newcomers. Your partner's dead, and his conspiracy's blown wide open. Conspiracy. Whitfield laughed, a sound like breaking glass. My dear Sheriff, you misunderstand the situation entirely. Judge Ashford was a visionary, yes, but he was also a man who let his passion for progress cloud his judgment. The colonel's men spread out in a practiced formation, surrounding the little group by the burned cabin. Professional gunmen, Nathaniel realized. The kind who killed for money and slept soundly. Afterward, you see, Whitfield continued, the judge's methods were crude. Effective, perhaps, but lacking in subtlety. I prefer a more civilized approach to business. Civilized. Rosalind's voice cracked like a whip. You call poisoning my husband civilized? I call it efficient, Whitfield replied. Though I must admit, the poisoning was Ashford's idea. I would have simply bought you out at a fair price and been done with it. And when we refused, then you would have had an unfortunate accident. Quick, clean, and regrettable. But the judge preferred his theatrical gestures. The fires, the threats, the hired thugs. All so unnecessary. One of the deputies shifted position, trying to get a better angle on the riders. But Whitfield's men were professionals. They'd already anticipated the move. I wouldn't, the colonel said mildly. My associates have very quick reflexes, and I'd hate for anyone else to die tonight. There's been quite enough bloodshed already. What do you want? Nathaniel asked, though he already knew the answer. The same thing Ashford wanted, of course. This land, the mineral rights, the railroad access. The only difference is that I'm willing to pay for it. Whitfield reached into his coat and pulled out a leather portfolio. Mrs. Thorne, I'm prepared to offer you $10,000 for your claim. Cash, paid immediately. Enough to start a new life anywhere you choose. It was a fortune, more money than most people saw in a lifetime. But Nathaniel watched Rosalind's face and knew she'd never take it. No, she said simply. No. Whitfield's eyebrows rose. My dear woman, surely you can't be serious. You're standing in the ruins of your home, surrounded by armed men, holding evidence of a conspiracy that has already claimed your husband's life. What exactly do you think you're fighting for? I'm fighting for the right to say no, Rosalind replied. For the right to live my life without being bought or bullied or murdered for convenience. Noble sentiments, Whitfield said. But ultimately, pointless. You see, I don't actually need your permission to take this land. I have the resources to tie up your claim in legal proceedings for years. I have the political connections to have the surveys redone in my favor. And I have the patience to wait for whatever illness is slowly killing you to finish its work. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking. But Nathaniel had heard enough. You're forgetting something, Colonel, he said. And what's that? You're not the only one with money and connections in this territory. Whitfield's smile faltered slightly. Ah yes, the Railroad King. I'd wondered when you'd make your play. Though I'm curious, what exactly do you think you can offer Mrs. Thorne that I can't? Protection, Nathaniel said simply. And something you'll never understand. Which is love. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Nathaniel had never said it aloud before, had barely admitted it to himself. But standing there in the ruins of everything Rosalind had built, facing down killers and conspirators, and the kind of casual evil that destroyed lives for profit, he knew it was the only truth that mattered. Love, Whitfield repeated, his tone mocking. How wonderfully romantic. Though I'm afraid love won't stop bullets, Mr. Cordova. That's when the storm hit. The first drops of rain hissed against the burning timbers like angry snakes. Within seconds, the sprinkle became a downpour, turning the world into a gray curtain of water and wind. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark, horrifying detail. Take cover, Hartwell shouted, but his words were lost in the crash of thunder. Nathaniel grabbed Rosalind's hand, pulling her toward the stone foundation of the cabin, the only solid shelter left standing. The journal pressed against her chest, its pages now protected by her body as she clutched it like a lifeline. Through the driving rain, he could see Whitfield's men struggling to control their horses. Professional gunmen or not, they were at the mercy of the storm just like everyone else. The creek, Rosalind shouted over the wind. It's rising. She was right. The normally placid stream was becoming a torrent, fed by runoff from the mountains and the fury of the storm. In the lightning flashes, Nathaniel could see it overflowing. Its banks, rushing toward them with the force of a freight train. Flash flood, he yelled to Hartwell. We need to get to higher ground. But as they stumbled through the rain and darkness, shots rang out. Whitfield's men were firing blind, hoping to hit something in the chaos. A bullet whined past Nathaniel's ear, close enough to singe his hair. This way, Rosalind tugged at his arm, leading him toward a rocky outcrop that rose above the flood. Plain. There's a cave up there. James and I used to shelter there during storms. They scrambled up the wet rocks, their boots slipping on the slick stone. Behind them, the creek roared like a living thing, swallowing the remains of the cabin and everything else in its path. Halfway up the slope, Nathaniel looked back and saw one of Whitfield's men caught in the flood, his horse screaming as the water swept them both downstream. Another rider was trying to reach higher ground, but his mount stumbled and went down, throwing him into the rushing water. Help! The man's voice was barely audible over the storm. I can't swim. Nathaniel hesitated. The man had been ready to kill him minutes ago. Justice said to let the flood take him, but mercy said otherwise. Wait here, he told Rosalind, then started back down the slope. Nathaniel, no, she called after him. It's too dangerous. But he was already moving, fighting his way through the storm toward the drowning man. The current was vicious, full of debris and strong enough to crush a man against the rocks. But Nathaniel had grown up near water, had learned to read the patterns of flood and flowed. He reached the man just as the current would have swept him over a waterfall. With his belt as a lifeline, he managed to drag the half-drowned gunman to safety on a boulder that stood like an island in the chaos. Why? The man gasped, coughing up creek water. Why save me? Because that's what separates us from them, Nathaniel replied, looking back toward where Whitfield and his remaining men were retreating to higher ground. We don't let people die just because it's convenient. The storm was beginning to pass, the rain easing to a steady drizzle. In the growing quiet, they could hear voices calling, Sheriff Hartwell and his deputies, accounting for everyone who'd survived the flood, but one voice was missing. Rosalind, Nathaniel called out, his heart suddenly pounding. Rosa, where are you? No answered. He scrambled up the rocks toward the cave where he'd left her, his boots slipping on the wet stone. The journal lay abandoned on a ledge, its pages fluttering in the wind, but Rosalind was gone. Dawn broke over Devil's Canyon like a blade drawn from its sheath, all sharp edges and glinting steel. Nathaniel sat his horse on the rim, James Thorne's journal tucked inside his coat, watching the shadows retreat from the maze of red rock below. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp, but the peace was deceptive. He wasn't alone. Despite the message's demand, Sheriff Hartwell and his deputies were positioned along the canyon walls, invisible from below but ready to act. The wounded lawman had refused to stay behind, his arm in a sling but his rifle steady in his good hand. You see anything? Hartwell's voice carried on the morning wind, barely audible. Not yet, Nathaniel replied. But he could feel eyes watching him, could sense the trap waiting to spring. Whitfield was too smart to simply trade Rosalind for the journal. He'd want both, and everyone who knew about the conspiracy dead besides that a hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing off the canyon walls. In the distance, Nathaniel could see storm clouds gathering again. This country's weather was as unpredictable as its people. Then he saw her. Rosalind stood on a narrow ledge halfway down the canyon wall, her hands bound behind her back. Even from a distance, he could see she was alive, though she swayed slightly, as if fighting dizziness. The poisoning was getting worse. Punctual as always, Mr. Cordova, came Whitfield's voice from the shadows. Though I do hope you followed instructions about coming alone. I'm here, Nathaniel called back. Let her go. The journal first. I don't think so. Nathaniel's hand rested on his gun. She comes down, then we talk. A laugh echoed through the canyon. You're hardly in a position to negotiate. One word. From me, and my associate will give Mrs. Thorne a rather permanent solution to her current predicament. As if summoned by his words, a figure stepped into view beside Rosalind, Caleb Brennan, the youngest of the brothers. So they hadn't all fled after all. The boy's face was pale but determined, a knife held at Rosalind's throat. Turns out young. Caleb here has a talent for tracking, Whitfield continued. Found your lady friend trying to signal you from that cave. Brought her to me like a faithful hound. What do you want, Whitfield? Nathaniel demanded. I want this territory to fulfill its destiny, the colonel replied, his voice taking on the fervor of a true believer. Railroads connecting east to west. Cities rising from the desert. Civilization replacing chaos. And yes, I want the silver. That will pay for it all. And Rosalind. Mrs. Thorne is an obstacle to progress. As are you, I'm afraid. The journal contains too many names, too many details. It would be inconvenient if it ever saw the inside of a courtroom. Nathaniel studied the canyon, calculating angles and distances. Caleb Brennan was young, nervous, probably more scared than dangerous, but he was still holding a knife to the throat of the woman Nathaniel loved. You know what I think? Nathaniel called out. I think you're a coward, Whitfield, hiding behind hired guns and scared boys. If you want this journal so badly, come take it yourself. Oh, I intend to, the colonel replied. But first, let me show you what happens to people who interfere with my plans. Caleb's hand tightened on the knife, and Rosalind gasped. A thin line of blood appeared on her neck. That's when Nathaniel made his choice. He spurred his horse forward. Not toward the canyon floor where Whitfield waited, but along the rim toward the narrow trail that led down to Rosalind's ledge. It was a desperate gambit. The path was treacherous even in good weather, and the recent storm had made it deadly. But love made men do desperate things. Stop! Whitfield's voice cracked with rage. I'll kill her. No, you won't, Nathaniel shouted, back as his horse picked its way down the crumbling trail. You need her alive to get this journal. Gunfire erupted from the canyon floor, bullets sparking off the rock face around him. But Whitfield's remaining men were shooting upward at a moving target, and their shots went wide. Above him, Sheriff Hartwell and his deputies opened fire, their rifles booming like thunder. The sound echoed and re-echoed through the canyon, making it impossible to tell how many shooters there were or where they were positioned. Nathaniel's horse stumbled on the loose shale, nearly going to its knees. He threw himself from the saddle just as the animal regained its footing, then scrambled. The last 20 feet to Rosalind's ledge on foot, Caleb Brennan spun toward him, his eyes wide with panic. Stay back. I'll cut her throat. No, you won't, Nathaniel said quietly. Because you're not a killer, Caleb. You're just a scared kid who got in over his head. I am too a killer, the boy protested, but his voice cracked. I've killed before. When? Where? Nathaniel took a careful step closer. I know your type, son. All bluster and no backbone. You follow your brothers around like a lost puppy, hoping they'll finally accept you as a man. That ain't true. Then prove it. Kill her. Nathaniel's voice was ice cold, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. Go ahead. Cut her throat and show me what a big, brave man you are. The knife trembled in Caleb's hand. He looked from Nathaniel to Rosalind, then back again. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. I can't, he whispered. No, Nathaniel said gently. Because you're better than your brothers. Better than Whitfield. You still have a choice, Caleb. You can walk away from this. The boy's hand fell to his side. The knife clattered to the rocks. That's right, Nathaniel said, moving to cut Rosalind's bonds. Now get out of here. Find someplace far from this territory and make a new life for yourself. Caleb nodded, tears streaming down his face. He scrambled up the rock face like a frightened rabbit, disappearing over the rim. Nathaniel, Rosalind gasped as the ropes fell from her wrists. The journal. He has to be stopped. I know. He pulled her against his chest, feeling the rapid flutter of her heart. But first, we need to get you to a doctor. The poisoning can wait, she said firmly. This ends now. From below came the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Whitfield, coming to claim his prize personally. The gunfire had stopped. Either the colonel's men were dead or they'd retreated. Stay here, Nathaniel told Rosalind, but she shook her head. No, more running, she said. No more hiding. We finish this together. They made their way down to the canyon floor, where Whitfield waited alone beside a small spring that bubbled up from the rocks. The colonel had dismounted, his rifle cradled in his arms, his face calm and assured. How touching, he said as they approached. Love conquers all, I suppose. Though I'm afraid it won't conquer bullets. Maybe not, Nathaniel agreed. But it'll outlast them. He pulled James Thorne's journal from his coat, holding it where Whitfield could see it. This what you want, among other things. Then take it. Nathaniel threw the journal toward the spring. It landed with a splash, its pages immediately beginning to soak through. No, Whitfield lunged forward, his rifle forgotten as he reached for the drowning book. That's when Sheriff Hartwell's voice echoed from the canyon rim. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and attempted murder. Whitfield spun, his rifle coming up, but Nathaniel was already moving. The two men collided beside the spring, grappling for control of the weapon. They rolled across the wet stones, each fighting for his life. The rifle discharged into the air, the shot echoing like thunder. Then it was just fists and determination, the older man's experience against Nathaniel's youth and strength that in the end, it was Rosalind who settled it. While the men fought, she'd pulled the journal from the spring, shaking water from its pages. Now she stood over the struggling figures, holding the book like a weapon. Enough, she said quietly. Both men froze, breathing hard. This is my husband's journal, Rosalind continued. It tells the story of his murder, and yours, Colonel. But more than that, it tells the story of a man who loved this land enough to die for it. She looked around the canyon, at the red rocks, glowing in the morning sun, at the small spring bubbling with clear, clean water, water that hadn't been poisoned like the creek. James dreamed of families settling here, she said. Children playing by this spring. A community built on hope, instead of greed. Foolish dreams, Whitfield gasped. Maybe, Rosalind agreed. But they're worth fighting for. 6 months later, the first houses of New Esperanza rose from the valley floor like flowers after rain. The silver mine, legitimately purchased and properly operated, provided prosperity for the whole community. The railroad came through, bringing progress and connection to the outside world. But the real treasure wasn't buried in the ground. It was found in the way Rosalind's garden bloomed that first spring, fed by clean water and tended by loving hands. In the sound of children's laughter echoing from the schoolhouse. In the way she looked at Nathaniel as they stood together on the porch of their new home, watching the sun set over the land they'd fought so hard to protect. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked one evening, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their first child grew. "Giving up your old life for this?" "Never," he said, pulling her close. "Some things are worth more than money, Rosa. Some things are worth everything." In the distance, thunder rumbled, promising rain for the thirsty earth. But the storms didn't frighten them anymore. They'd weathered worse than weather could bring, and they'd emerged stronger for it. Love, as it turned out, was indeed stronger than bullets. And from the ashes of tragedy, hope had bloomed like desert roses after the rain. Well now, that was quite a tale, wasn't it? If this story stirred something in your heart like wind through prairie grass, I'd be mighty obliged if you'd tap that like button and leave me a comment about what moved you most. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of love and adventure. From the wild frontier. Speaking of frontier spirit, I'm curious, where in this wide world are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let me know what corner of creation you call home.